move into our question and answer session. So our first question that we have is, what recommendations do you have for building networks to address preparedness, response, and recovery efforts to wildfire events? And especially if you could focus on what's worked well that you've seen in getting all of the stakeholders, so businesses, communities, private citizens, government, public, everyone engaged in the entire process.
So I'll go ahead and step up. In the Southeast, when we work to build networks related to fire, we're often involved with networks of folks who are already in our region actively involved in prescribed fire and also other forms of fire management. And so we've worked quite a bit with the prescribed fire councils across the Southeast, and the prescribed fire councils in Georgia and Florida and the Carolinas, Alabama, Louisiana, and elsewhere, they tend to be made up of groups of folks who represent the diversity of the wildland fire management community we have in the Southeast. We'll work with those folks because in the same room, from one year to the next, you'll see federal agencies represented. You'll see state agencies, both the forestry and the wildlife agencies. You'll see engaged private landowners. You'll see folks in the forestry and contract burning communities. You'll see groups like the Nature Conservancy and other NGOs. And so working through the existing prescribed fire council networks, we feel like we've been able to effectively connect with a lot of different people across the Southeast. And I know nationwide we've seen the rise of some groups like the Fire Learning Network that's hosted by the Nature Conservancy, and they work coast to coast on a wide range of issues related to prescribed fire management and wildland fire management and WUI type issues. And similar to the FLN is the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. And they tend to be a professional network of people and groups who are working together to address prescribed fire and wildland fire issues nationwide.
Great, thank you. So our next question is more for Vaughn. Do you know if Ventura County has any active CERT teams, and what role did they play in the Thomas Fire, if any?
We train in CERT, and we do have some teams that are that help out. Unfortunately, our teams were our East County teams, and I just got to say that we activated our volunteers and our CERT teams at some point, but they were only active in incident support. They weren't operational during, especially the rapid expansion of the fire. You know, as you can hear from my story, it was extremely quick. The sheriff has also a tactical response team, which incorporates their volunteer search and rescue, and they were on standby and deployed during the fire to assist with evacuations.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. We've got our next question is, what are some fire science topics that need further research and would also prove useful to communities as they plan for and adapt to future wildfire events? You know, what are topics that maybe we only have a little bit of information on that we really need more? I know touched on technology advances, maybe in prediction. So I'm just going to throw that out there to everyone.
Well, I'll jump in and say that we probably know a whole lot and don't need a ton more in terms of basic wildland fire science. We probably need a lot more social science research to looking at how, say, communities might more effectively embrace wildfire adaptations. I think that's a really rich area we should look at. For example, say work by Travis Paveglio at University of Idaho. He's looked at different community types that look at different kinds of WUI communities, wildland-urban interface, that might embrace different kinds of wildfire adaptation strategies. So a one-size-fits-all approach to how communities should better adapt may not work very well. We've got some formalized suburban WUI communities all the way to really rural working landscapes that are resource dependent. And I think what's going to work in those different contexts really probably needs to be looked at in a lot more detail. And I think social scientists can give us a real lens of insight into that arena.
I'll add that I see that we need more information, not just on wildfire science, but in particular in the Southeast. And I think there's a growing recognition across the country too that we need more prescribed fire science. We need information and resources tied to the kinds of fires that we use, and that kind of research looks at fire from a different angle, maybe a different paradigm. And I know in the Southeast for sure, we need prescribed fire science tools that will help us to help our managers to better understand and predict smoke movement, so that they can use this management tool with our growing population and the folks who are sensitive to smoke and the concerns about smoke and roadways. We need better fire models that are based not on, the 99th percentile wildfire conditions. We need fire models that will help fire managers to predict fire behavior in circumstances where they're actually using fire, which tend to be more moderate weather conditions. And we need fire behavior models that will help to predict and understand what the fire is going to do when we're burning under more moderate conditions, when we're not really concerned about things that are going to be spotting miles ahead, but instead we might have a variety of different ignition scenarios going on simultaneously, whether that's on the ground, on ATVs, or using helicopters. But in those kinds of situations, we're not looking at Rothermill's fire spread equations. We're looking at, converging fire lines. We're looking at backing fires, heading fires, flanking fires, all at the same time. And so I think, a lot of our managers this is the kinds of fire science that they could use on the ground for managing fire, particularly these prescribed fires. And there's a growing recognition that we have a lot of information that's based on wildfires, and that doesn't always apply or translate to prescribed fire applications.
Great, thank you for that. And our next question is kind of a long one here. So we've seen fires allowed to burn in the wilderness or wild areas turn into large wildfires that need to be fought rigorously, costing millions of dollars in suppression and lost business due to long-term smoke impacts on the community. So then how do we balance the benefits of letting these fires burn, knowing that they're eventually going to blow up and require suppression efforts? And how do you balance, and I'll add on to that, how do you balance watching those fires and making sure they don't get out of control?
It's a tough one. It's really literally the $1 million question, because in California we've been dealing with that for a long time, and there are wilderness areas out there, and our population wants them to be as natural as they can be, and yet they want to live bordering them or in them, and they expect protection. So it's definitely a balancing act. I think it's an education process. I think, my impression is listening to everybody here talk, the citizenry that lives here probably doesn't interact with the decisions that really govern their lives as much as they probably could and should. And, they probably need to weigh in on that decision on preservation of the natural habitat versus the ability to live.
Great, thanks for that. David, do you have any suggestions or insights on that from the Southeast, where you have a lot of different stakeholders involved in this?
Well, it's an interesting question. I can only think of really a few situations in the Southeast where we have had natural ignitions allowed to burn for a while. Given our landscapes, we don't have a lot of space to let these kinds of fires go typically. I would say, to respond to the last bit of the question, we don't necessarily always know that these fires in wilderness areas are going to blow up. And those tend to be the ones that we remember and the ones that stick out. But for all of the situations where you have burns that were allowed to be managed for some time, and then were either successfully suppressed or went out on their own, given changes in fuels or season-ending events, things like that. Those tend not to be the stories that we remember. So just because a few of these kinds of fires get out doesn't mean that's necessarily the narrative that's always happening.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for that. We've got time for just one last question. And that question is, what are some of the most common misconceptions you come across regarding wildfire risks or management? And do you have any suggestions for how to address those misconceptions that you've encountered?
I would say that some of the primary misconceptions that I run into are that federal fuels reduction on federal lands or simply more logging can solve our wildfire problem. And the Forest Service has been the primary agency responsible for fire suppression. So I just think many people expect then that that agency is the one that's going to solve the problem as well. But I think we have to sort of shift our thinking and consider, rather than just focusing on how we can keep the forest from burning, or really the shrubland and grassland as well, which is equally, if not more important in some areas, we need to really start concentrating more on how we can better protect homes and communities. So I think there has to be a real shift in our policy focus if we really want to keep people safe.
And I'll add, I think, I know in the Southeast, particularly in our coastal areas and our areas in the mountains, but I also hear it's quite an issue in places like Idaho and other parts of the West. Just in general, we have a very transient population these days where folks are moving from one region to the next all the time. And with that come changes in our understanding and our perceptions of wildfire risks and even of natural fire regimes. And I think that pretty much wherever you are, our fire management institutions and our education programs are going to need to be ongoing efforts to continue to educate folks as they move around the country for various regions about the particular fire regimes that they're moving in and out of, because fire is different in many different areas, and we have different strategies and we have different tools, but folks don't necessarily pick up that information when they move to a new neighborhood in a new state.
I think I'll take the cost part. I think it's expensive to fight fires, period. I mean, firefighters are definitely putting themselves at risk, but from an employer's perspective, they are employees and they deserve to be assigned to work in a safe environment, as safe environment as we can make for them, with as many tools as we can give them so that they can do their job. And to do that job in a very dynamic and dangerous environment is difficult. It takes quite a bit of support. It takes quite a bit of management and communication and technical capabilities out there. And I think that the costs associated with fighting fires, they are necessary, and they will grow, because this is a very complex business. And that piece of it, I think, is probably deserves some attention out there, that we're putting people that are our employees out there on the line in very dangerous places, and they deserve to come home. And so we need to make sure that they do, and that costs money, that costs time, that costs resources to deploy, and navigating all that definitely drives the overall bill up for sure.
Great, thank you for that. So that's about all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for your excellent questions, and just want to say thank you to Tanya, David, and Vaughn for your great presentations today and the vibrant discussion. And if there are any questions that you have today that were not addressed during our question and answer session, please feel free to send them to us at cipinfo@americangeosciences.org, and we'll make sure to send your questions along to the speakers. And we will be posting a recording of today's webinar on our Critical Issues webinar page soon. You can see that there at americangeosciences.org/policy-critical issues/webinars. And you can go ahead and visit that website to view this webinar as well as past webinars on a wide variety of geoscience topics. And again, thank you, Tanya and David and Vaughn, for sharing your time, expertise, and insights with us today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody attending did too. This concludes our webinar for today, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.